A 62-year-old cold case was not solved by a witness, a confession, or a traditional detective. It was solved by an FBI agent racing through a frozen Memphis cargo facility to rescue a microscopic piece of evidence before time ran out. In late 1963, 12-year-old Mary Theresa Simpson and her father Ellsworth left their home to start fresh in nearby Hammondsport. But just 2 weeks before March 15, 1964, a new job brought them back to Elmira, New York. Mary Theresa was a quiet girl who wore distinctive cat-eye glasses and kept a fan club card tucked in her pocket. Because of the recent move, she was now navigating a city she was still trying to refamiliarize herself with. That Sunday afternoon, she went to visit her mother, Rose. The hours passed uneventfully. At approximately 7 in the evening, as the daylight faded and the winter temperatures dropped, Mary Theresa was seen beginning the walk back toward her father's apartment. She never arrived. The hours dragged on. The streetlights flickered on and the sidewalks emptied. Ellsworth waited, but the knock on the door never came. By 10:30 that night, the Elmira Police Department officially registered her as a missing person. Law enforcement immediately initiated a massive grid search across the city and its wooded outskirts. Officers knocked on doors, checked garages, and questioned anyone who had been outside that Sunday evening. Volunteers spread out along the river and into the empty lots on the city's edges. 4 days later, on the morning of March 19th, a hiker off Combs Hill Road made a discovery that would haunt the department for generations. The 4-day search came to a tragic and definitive end on an old logging road. The site had been deliberately concealed under heavy fieldstones, pointing directly to a highly calculated act. Following the medical examiner's official evaluation, authorities immediately reclassified the situation from a missing person search to an active criminal investigation. Investigators carefully collected what was left behind. They recovered her cat-eye glasses, her fan club card, and crucial microscopic forensic material from her clothing. Detectives meticulously logged these items and placed them in a secure freezer at police headquarters, treating the fabric as if they knew someone in the future would need it. The physical evidence was perfectly preserved, but the suspect had vanished without a trace. The trail went cold almost immediately. Investigators had no idea they were looking for a phantom, and it would take 6 decades, a historic natural disaster, and a massive leap in genetic technology to finally close the file. The immediate aftermath of the discovery forced the Elmira Police Department into a relentless, round-the-clock operation. Detectives systematically canvassed the eastern side of the city and the rural routes leading toward Combs Hill. They pulled employment records, checked vehicle registrations, and conducted formal interviews with more than 300 individuals known to be in the area during the weekend of March 15, 1964. Investigators cross-referenced local offenders, scrutinized men who drove heavy delivery routes, and followed up on hundreds of citizen tips phoned into the station. Every lead was meticulously investigated, checked against the timeline, and ultimately eliminated. Not a single interview yielded a viable suspect. The individual responsible for the incident had completely bypassed the initial law enforcement sweep. As months turned into years, the investigation stalled. The massive case file remained open, but the actionable leads dried up entirely. Elmira police officers who worked the original perimeter eventually retired, passing the heavy stacks of typewritten reports to a new generation of detectives. Those younger officers read the exact same notes and reached the exact same dead ends. The physical evidence remained locked inside the precinct freezer, completely untouched, waiting for a scientific method that did not yet exist. Outside the police station, time took a heavy toll on the Simpson family. Mary Theresa's older sister, Linda Galpin, was 16 years old when her sister disappeared. She assumed the heavy burden of keeping the case active in the minds of the authorities. Year after year, decade after decade, Linda routinely called the Elmira Police Department. She asked the exact same question, pushing for an update. Each time, the department gave her the exact same answer: the file had not moved. Her parents, Ellsworth and Rose, aged, and eventually passed away, never knowing the identity of the person who took their daughter. The first true shift in the investigation arrived in the year 2000. 36 years after the initial investigation began, forensic science had finally caught up to the evidence waiting in the freezer. The New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center took custody of the preserved clothing. Using modern extraction techniques, scientists successfully isolated a clear, usable male DNA profile from the fabric. With a definitive genetic fingerprint in hand, authorities immediately submitted the data to CODIS, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's national database of convicted offenders. If the suspect had ever been convicted of a qualifying felony anywhere in the United States, his DNA would be on file, and the system would automatically flag a match. The search concluded, and the system returned 0 results. The unknown male was not in the federal registry. 3 years later, in 2003, technicians submitted additional pieces of the preserved clothing to the state laboratory. They successfully extracted additional microscopic forensic data, strengthening the clarity of the original genetic profile. They ran the updated data through CODIS again. Once more, the database found nothing. A final, exhaustive federal database search was executed in 2014. The outcome remained unchanged. The forensic results confirmed a frustrating reality for law enforcement. The suspect had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. He had remained completely off the radar of the justice system for his entire life. Traditional police work and federal databases had reached their absolute limits, leaving the Elmira Police Department holding a perfect DNA profile with no name attached to it. By 2022, traditional avenues were completely exhausted. The Elmira Police Department realized that relying on federal criminal registries would never yield a suspect. The individual they were looking for had clearly managed to avoid systemic detection. They needed a method that did not depend on prior arrests. They turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a rapidly advancing technique capable of identifying a person through their distant relatives. Elmira Police Sergeant William Goodwin initiated the new phase of the investigation. He applied for and secured a grant from Season of Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding advanced scientific testing for unsolved cases. The objective was clear: transport the final piece of evidence to Othram Technologies in Texas, a laboratory specifically engineered to analyze severely degraded material. This facility possessed the exact technology required to read genetic data that older systems simply could not process. But investigators faced a highly critical problem. Decades of storage and previous testing rounds had severely depleted the physical evidence. Only 0.4 nanograms of DNA remained. To put this in perspective, 1 nanogram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. The sample was entirely invisible to the naked eye. This was their absolute last chance. If the sample was destroyed or failed to yield data, the case would be permanently closed, and the identity of the perpetrator would be permanently lost to history. FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen, who was actively assisting local authorities, took custody of the microscopic evidence. He carefully packed the material in dry ice and shipped it via FedEx, routing it through the company's massive international hub in Memphis, Tennessee. The protocol was standard, but the timing proved to be nearly catastrophic. A historic winter storm struck Memphis, completely paralyzing the cargo hub. The shipment was grounded. Thousands of flights were canceled, and the facility ceased all operations. The delay created an immediate crisis. The dry ice keeping the sample stable had a strict, finite expiration window. If the ice thawed, the 60-year-old biological material would degrade instantly, erasing the only remaining link to the perpetrator. Agent Jensen watched the tracking status freeze. Knowing he could not reach anyone at the civilian facility, he initiated an emergency response to salvage the sole remaining piece of physical proof. Agent Jensen contacted the FBI's regional liaison in Memphis. Federal agents bypassed the stalled civilian logistics network and entered the freezing cargo warehouse. They conducted a manual, physical search for one specific box among thousands of stranded parcels. They located the package just before the temperature shifted and immediately transferred it into a secure bureau freezer until the weather cleared and flights resumed. This swift federal intervention saved the decades-long investigation from failing due to weather. The sample reached Othram intact. Scientists applied forensic-grade genome sequencing, successfully translating the microscopic fragment into a comprehensive genetic profile. The profile was then uploaded to public genealogy databases to identify individuals who shared matching genetic markers. The investigation shifted from laboratories to paper trails. Investigators formed a partnership with Dr. Christina Lane, a criminologist and associate professor at Russell Sage College. Her team of researchers, working alongside federal agents, began building complex family trees based on the new genetic data. This required an intense focus on public records to trace the lineage of the matched profiles. The work was slow and methodical. The team spent 2 years painstakingly analyzing census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and historical documents. They traced the genetic branches backward and forward, mapping generations of families across upstate New York to see where the DNA intersected with the local geography. Every single document had to be verified to ensure the accuracy of the family line. By the end of this meticulous process, the massive web of data began to shrink. The branches were eliminated one by one, the records aligned, the geographic locations matched, and the genealogical tree finally collapsed down to a single individual. The forensic science had finally pointed to a specific name, breaking the silence that had surrounded the case since 1964. The data pointed to one specific name, Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. In March 1964, Murray was 32 years old. He was a United States Army veteran and a commercial truck driver employed by Mayflower Van Lines. His daily work required a deep familiarity with the rural outskirts, the logging trails, and the quiet edges of Elmira. He knew the local geography intimately, especially the isolated areas outside the city limits. This specific occupational background gave him an operational advantage, allowing him to navigate the terrain without drawing any immediate suspicion from local authorities. Despite holding a documented criminal record that included prior severe legal infractions, Murray completely bypassed the initial law enforcement dragnet. Investigators had scoured the city and questioned hundreds of men, yet Murray's name never appeared in the thousands of pages of original police interviews. He simply maintained his routine. He went to work, returned home to his wife, Rosemary, and raised a family in the exact same city where the investigation was actively failing. He blended perfectly into the background of a community that was desperately searching for him. Murray lived a long, undisturbed life. He eventually retired and died of natural causes at the age of 73 on March 16, 2004. For the detectives reviewing the file decades later, the date of his death stood out with a cold precision. He died exactly 40 years to the day after authorities made the initial discovery on the hillside of Combs Hill. This chronological coincidence added a heavy psychological weight to the case file for the officers who had spent their entire careers chasing his shadow. Finding a name on a genealogical tree provides a direction, but it does not close a case. Because the suspect was deceased, investigators needed undeniable, direct physical proof to officially hold him responsible. Special Agent Kenneth Jensen, who had transitioned into a forensic case manager role at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, stepped in to help secure the specialized resources necessary for this highly complex final phase. Federal and state agencies had to coordinate meticulously to ensure the highest legal threshold for proof was met. The Elmira Police Department first approached Murray's surviving son. He agreed to cooperate with the authorities and provided a voluntary DNA sample. The subsequent laboratory analysis returned a high-probability familial link to the genetic profile recovered from the 1964 evidence. This connection instantly shifted the trajectory of the investigation from a theoretical lead to a concrete probability. While the familial link offered strong circumstantial backing, standard investigative protocol requires absolute scientific certainty. To achieve this, authorities petitioned for and obtained legal authorization for a disinterment. In November 2025, forensic teams arrived at an Elmira cemetery and officially exhumed Murray's remains. The operation was conducted with strict procedural oversight to maintain the absolute integrity of the chain of custody. State forensic technicians carefully extracted genetic material directly from the deceased suspect. They placed this direct sample against the profile built from the microscopic fragment rescued during the Memphis winter storm. The technicians ran the comparison through rigorous validation processes to eliminate any possibility of a systemic error. The analysis yielded a definitive match. The laboratory confirmed that the statistical probability of selecting a random, unrelated individual with those exact genetic markers was less than 1 in 320 billion. The science left zero room for doubt. The suspect, who had outlasted generations of detectives, finally had a confirmed and proven identity. The forensic data provided the final, irrefutable answer to a question that had haunted an entire city for over half a century. Because the suspect was already deceased, the legal process reached an immediate conclusion. There would be no arrest warrant issued. There would be no criminal trial. The constitutional requirement for a courtroom defense was rendered obsolete by the suspect's passing. The direct DNA extraction served as the final, absolute verdict. Law enforcement now held the heavy obligation to present this scientific certainty to the public and, most importantly, to the family that had waited more than half a century. The burden of proof had been entirely shifted from a jury to a laboratory. On the morning of February 10, 2026, officials gathered inside the Chemung County District Attorney's office in Elmira. The room was tightly packed with current detectives and retired officers who had inherited the file decades earlier. Police Chief Kristen Thorne stepped to the podium. She formally announced the closure of the 1964 investigation. District Attorney Whedon Wetmore followed, confirming to the press that the physical evidence left zero room for debate regarding the identity of the perpetrator. He emphasized that the procedural science was absolute and indisputable. With that public statement, it was officially recorded as the oldest cold case ever solved by DNA in the history of New York State. Sitting in the front row of the room were the surviving relatives of Mary Theresa Simpson. Her uncle, Dwayne Bowman, and her cousin, Ronnie Bowman, attended the briefing. Sitting alongside them was Mary Theresa's older sister, Linda Galpin. She was now 78 years old. She had spent the last 62 years making phone calls to the police, asking for an answer that an entire generation of investigators could not provide. She had outlived her parents, outlived the original detectives, and outlived the perpetrator himself. Linda listened quietly as the police chief stated the name of the man who had lived his life unnoticed in their city. She finally had the identity of the individual responsible for fracturing her family. When the officials finished their briefing, Linda addressed the room. Her words carried the heavy weight of a lifelong wait. She stated clearly, "I am just glad justice was finally done. I always said it would never happen in my lifetime." Her statement marked the definitive end to a 62-year cycle of unresolved grief and institutional silence. Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. completely evaded the justice system while he was alive. He maintained his freedom by relying on the limitations of 1960s police methods. But he could not outlast the physical evidence he left behind. The biological material he abandoned in the winter of 1964 became the exact instrument of his eventual identification. The resolution of this specific investigation forces a heavy, modern question. Given the absolute success of genetic genealogy in closing cases that were considered permanently unsolved, should law enforcement be required to automatically run familial DNA testing on every cold case on record? Or does the forced use of public genetic databases cross a boundary into personal privacy? Let me know exactly where you draw the line in the comments below. If this factual breakdown provided value to you, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss our next case file.